This conference will now be recorded.
Our first meeting in 2021 is on January 5th, and is it at that meeting that we will really spend most of that steering committee meeting, first one of the year, making more detailed introductions of each other. So we're anxious to have a lot of good folks this year, looking forward to that. So here's the agenda. We're going to work through each of these. We have a couple of other staff people going to join us towards the end to cover their specialty areas so they can better answer your questions. And first, we're going to look just a quick snapshot of homelessness. As you would imagine, because of COVID, we don't have numbers any more current at the moment than these 2019 numbers. We've been all busy doing other things. But basically, this is the 2019 snapshot. It shows it that night. There's one night every year in January, and it's coming up again, where we do the point in time count. So we make an attempt to count the homeless people, people experiencing homelessness around the state of North Carolina. It's a HUD requirement for all states, and this is the way it looked to us last year. As many of you are aware, this is the PIT count covers the last 10 days of January. It counts people experiencing what's called literal homelessness in our communities, which means they are living in a place not meant for human habitation in either emergency shelters, transitional housing programs dedicated to homeless people. If you'll notice, I'm not going to go through these data, you can see them, but I would direct your attention to the pie charts at the bottom because I suspect this is probably consistent with this year. But you'll notice something that may surprise folks is that 38% of homeless people experiencing homelessness are female, 17%, which is nearly 1 in 5, are children, and that there is a disproportionate, if you go up to the row above that, a disproportionate indication among African Americans. So even though that demographic only represents 22% of the North Carolina larger population, they represent 51% of people who are homeless. Did anybody have any questions on that? That was quick. That's the first slide. There's many more, but does anyone want to say anything to start before we get into other slides? Do you have anything, Adriana? I see something there. But there you
go. We're just trying to figure out some technical issues with the audio, but other than that, we're good.
Okay. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know.
Okay.
So we're going to go into a brief history of homelessness in the United States. I can tell you, as having been someone who worked 30 years ago in the 80s, when homelessness was we were just becoming aware of its existence. There actually was a time when there wasn't a large sampling of the population that found itself homeless. But then in the 80s, that began to appear, and it became the responsibility of advocates to bring that to the attention of the broader public and to lawmakers. And in the beginning, well, I can tell you before I go into these different decades that I am amazed now coming back into this work in this period, the progress that we have seen in terms of how we address it and the systems set up to not only acknowledge that it's there, but ways to address it more strategically maybe than when we did in the early days. In the 1980s, as you can see there, as we became aware, it was mainly about shelters, a first response. We moved into the 1990s when the problem didn't seem to be diminishing, and we developed continuums of care, which were created based on housing readiness model. And we're going to talk a little more in detail about that, but it had to do with you had a few things to do before we could find you housing if you had addiction issues and so on, but we'll get into that. And then in the 2000s, we came on this idea of a permanent supportive housing emphasis, that you would move from managing homelessness to ending homelessness by getting people into housing and then addressing those problems, because I think anyone knows how difficult it is to address anything without a home. So Congress mandated HMIS. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, a way of measuring and counting. And then local 10-year plans to end homelessness evolved during this period. We get to the 2010s, and we started to use evidence-based practices, new rapid rehousing and prevention emphasis in addition to permanent supportive housing, and then the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. That led to something called HEARTH legislation under the Obama administration. You see the date in which it was signed. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness was required to create that federal plan I mentioned. And it was the first significant homeless legislation for 20 years that we've covered. It does these, it's about these three areas. We know how to end homelessness. We know in order to end homelessness that individuals and families need these three things. They need an affordable place to live. They need the right services to help them maintain their homes. They need access to basic needs like food, behavioral health supports for mental health and substance abuse issues, and help with tenancy issues. And to maintain their new homes long-term, people need adequate income, both earned through employment or unearned income like SSI or disability income. So Housing First created a new approach. And over the last few years, our thinking about access to housing has changed. It used to be that people had to work on their barriers to housing before they thought about moving into a permanent place. They needed to be sober, work on getting a job or benefits, repair their credit history, get mental health treatment, and so on. These long shelter and transitional housing stays proved to be costly, and the long-term outcomes did not justify the cost of keeping people homeless longer in order to meet milestones on these interventions first. Instead of waiting until people are ready, the system has shifted to a housing first approach where people experiencing homelessness, despite whatever barriers might exist for them, move into housing as quickly as possible, and providers wrap services around them to meet their needs in permanent housing. Housing programs using a housing first approach have a better retention outcome and cost far less per outcome than either emergency shelters or transitional housing programs. And I'll leave you, we're going to open up the lines again because I'm sure there's experience out there that could lend itself to this transition over the last few decades. And here is the quote we'll leave you with before we get into more detail about continuums of care themselves. And you can read that for yourselves, I think. Does anybody have any comments they want to make or lend their experience through these decades of transition? And we'll open up the chat. We'll open up the mic, but also if there's anything on the chat, Adriana, let us know.
Nope, we're good to go for now.
Okay. All right, we're going to move forward. This quote has clearly left you all speechless. So continuums of care. We're going to talk about the definition at its simplest. It's established by representatives of relevant organizations within a geographic area. and they are commissioned to carry out the responsibilities set forth in the COC program interim rule. Membership should ensure community-wide commitment to ending and preventing homelessness, and the representation should be broader now of the relevant organizations within the entire geographic area covered by each COC. The board, which you're about to become a part of, is a subset of the membership that is established in accordance with the COC regulations governing board composition and board selection. The COC assigns the board responsibilities in a written agreement called the Governance Charter, and the board does not have an explicit role unless specified in the Governance Charter. Without assigning a duty to the board, responsibilities are retained by the COC. A COC board might look and act like an advisory or oversight committee of the COC coalition or network. Of course, you know that the Continuum of Care is also a source of federal funding. And so this body is charged with the distribution and monitoring and measurement of how well those funds get spent. Here are the COC functions. The 4 categories you can see across. One thing I learned from years of being head of a nonprofit is that the for-profit community has resources to understand better how to function efficiently and effectively. And so I shamelessly tried my best to apply some of those well-oiled strategies to our nonprofit. And I've been impressed how this particular COC does the same. And you'll see across those 4 columns, there's quite a lot that's expected of us to accomplish in order to manage these federal funds and the COC agencies that comprise it. So it's like a business without a COC. The administrative functions include, as you see there, governance, staffing of committees and work groups, which you all will be a part of, and a few new components outlined in the HARTH legislation designed to make the COCs more efficient and effective. We coordinate intake, also known as coordinated entry. It's also called coordinated assessment, but we kind of prefer coordinated entry. It's a one-stop shopping, easier for clients, more efficient in the long run for providers, so that if you're homeless, you don't have to figure out which agencies to go to, but you go to this one point, and that will help you find the services you need according to your needs. And we're going to go into detail on that soon. We develop written standards which promotes the transparency of these operations and our accountability to the system and to those federal dollars. There are performance expectations and monitoring. I mean, it makes sense. Again, in the for-profit world, you want to buy the best outcome for your money, but in order to show that, you're going to have to measure it and share it. And so we want to be sure that we're shifting resources to those agencies that are doing the best job of ending homelessness. It's a little, to me, it's a little elevated from a typical charity. There is an idea in our minds that we'd love to put ourselves out of business. And if we do this well, that just might be a goal someday. The Homeless Management Information System, HMIS, is required by HUD, and it reports to Congress every year through the Annual Homeless Assessment Report, or AHAR. So we have to be, we're a part of that. And then we plan for the future towards constant improvement and growth until we reach that goal of new careers for everybody, if we could solve this problem. The COCs have 9 basic management requirements. You can see them here. I don't know that I need to keep talking. There are 9 of them there. And you'll be engaged with all of this as being members of the steering committee. And then there are 5 basic planning responsibilities. System coordination, conducting the point in time count, which goes along with the housing inventory count. So not only what people are out there on that January week who are homeless, but what is the inventory, the capacity to serve them currently. And we're gearing up for that now. We're preparing to launch that with our agencies come January. It turns out that local municipalities are required to look at their problems relative to homelessness for other federal funding. And so we coordinate to provide that data for those consolidated plans. And then we have a very good relationship with the state agency at the Department of Health and Human Services in North Carolina. And we consult with those partners as well as local ESG, which is emergency solutions grants. We're going to talk about those in a minute. And the whole idea is to make the system run smoothly, that it has all the aspects it needs, and it often includes coordinating with other mainstream systems, as I mentioned. What is the HMIS? HMIS is an online system that tracks people experiencing homelessness and the services they receive. All providers who receive these federal dollars, and those are Continuum of Care, Emergency Solutions Grant, and the Supportive Services for Veteran Families. These are all these alphabet soup acronyms that you'll come to know and love. And they're all required to enter data into the HMS. The victim service providers that we have strong partnerships with are not. They have their own system due to the need for privacy in those situations of risk for those clients. We found the big piece that we do, the big project every year, is to facilitate the annual COC program application process. A collaborative, well, let me just say a collaborative, let's go through this list. So a collaborative applicant is a legal entity to submit the application on behalf of all the folks who are in our COC. NCCH, the North Carolina Coalition End Homelessness, is the collaborative applicant for the Balance of State COC. So our staff does all this work to get that ready every year. This year has been a unique year. Congress has still postponed its decision as to whether we will go through that arduous process of people applying for those funds, given all that's going on right now. So we're waiting to still hear from them on that. And here's some resources that you can, if you keep your link to this, we're going to send this link out later, but this will be your resource this whole slideshow, but also here are some more detailed pieces. We're kind of hitting the high points here. If you want to dig in a little deeper, here is the information that backs this up. And that's that section. Let's open the mics. Let's see if there's anyone on that wants to ask a question. Adriana, anything?
There's nothing in the chat, but if anyone needs to unmute themselves, they can do so.
Okay, so everyone can unmute themselves as they want to talk. Anyone? Okay. Sometimes I have a habit of calling people out, and I know Bonnie Harper's on this call. And I feel like you have a little more experience maybe than some. I didn't know if you wanted to lend that to this discussion. Is there anything that you would want to add, Bonnie, to this?
No, I think you're doing a really good job breaking it down.
Great. And Bonnie and I did talk about that endorsement before we started. Thank you, Bonnie. Okay, let's get into the state COC. This is where Bonnie will definitely have more experience than I will, but just to take a look, there's quite a history, as I understand, to the state of North Carolina's. There used to be more than 30 COCs in the state, and somehow over time we have come to a much more streamlined 12. So there are a dozen continuums of care. So you might have thought you were the only one, but you're joined by 11 others, and you see them listed there. You'll probably notice from the map that we cover a large swath of the state geographically, and that many of these counties are rural for the most part. And what I want to do too later on, I'm going to show you though, the awards that we get for the COC, I suppose it makes sense, would be the largest share, nearly 30% of the federal Continuum of Care grant goes to these balanced estate counties. So as you see here, there are 79, 13 regional planning bodies called regional committees, and of which some of you on the call are newly elected to serve and represent. They help the COC operate at the local level. Each regional committee meets regularly and discusses local strategies of how to end homelessness. Each regional committee has its own local system with access points to contact people, to connect people to emergency services, such as shelter and agencies that assess all literally homeless households for permanent housing interventions. We need public housing authorities to play a role in each of these regions to help determine and implement these strategies. The steering committee that you will serve on is the main decision-making body for the COC. And there is your work cut out for you there. So we'll be spending a lot of time together, and we'll be working through each of these tasks, most if not all, required by HUD in order to maintain federal resources that we receive and that we then disperse to the agencies in operating within each of the regions. You will be often invited to participate in subcommittees or work groups as they are needed. There is a connection, for example, with veteran homelessness, working in tandem with the governor's working committee on, it's called Operation Home. That meets every month. We work very closely with them. That's just one example. This year there was a racial equity subcommittee that was developed and did very well its first year out. Had some excellent conversations that it scheduled on our way towards some specific goals in that area. Whoops, sorry. As I mentioned, the steering committee has regional membership. You see it here. Each regional committee elects a regional lead, which I assume some of you are on this call. You represent your region at the steering committee, and on those rare occasions when you cannot attend, you're expected to have your alternate. These meetings have their HUD requirements as well, so we have pretty good attendance. And we do take attendance at those meetings and keep record as we're required to do. Everything is very transparent. Anyone can join these meetings. Our staff organizes those, and then the regional lead organizes local meetings and oversees those activities at that level. The steering committee also includes at-large members, and I'm so pleased to tell you we have some very exciting new organizations that will be represented on the at-large members. They represent the sector, preferably statewide, that regional leads cannot. So they definitely have missions that overlap the work we do, especially this past year. And in fact, some of them we've already we worked with because of COVID, And they have graciously decided to join us in a little more intimate connection through the steering committee. And those, we have 4 new agencies, and I think another 6 individuals agreed to stay on with us. And I really should have put the slide up here for you, but I didn't think. But again, we will meet each other in more detail in January. But the North Carolina Realtors Association, I will find out more, but they have a foundation, and their head of that executive committee is joining us. The Legal Services of North Carolina will be on our steering committee in 2021. The North Carolina Rural Center and the North Carolina Housing Coalition. So that's a great group. And some of it has come out of our realization at how unprepared we were to really, the state, to really deploy the unprecedented amount of funding that came through as a result of COVID. So we've been working together, and everybody's been touched by it, from eviction diversion, rental assistance, trying to keep people who have homes from becoming those without homes, and so on. The other regional committee leadership roles that you might want to kind of take a look at this and see what suits your fancy, because you would be asked to join at least one of these, as many as you like, but certainly one. And these are the committee roles at the steering committee we have, but we also, each of the regional committees is expected to elect folks to serve in these 4 capacities as well. So the coordinated entry, we're going to hear more about in a minute. The point in time count we've discussed. There needs to be a webmaster who maintains the regional committee minutes, and everything is documented and provides to staff for posting to the larger NCCEH website. And then the project review committee representative, who, this is an intensive piece because we review, score, and rank the COC and the ESG project applications. There's a lot of money coming your way in your regions, and there's a process for reviewing and recommending these grant transfer requests. We're going to talk about the 2 major ones in a second. The regional committees implement let's see, local coordinated entry council. They share resources and best practices. I think the more diverse your community partners, the more effective you can be. And it also helps you build political will, because everybody has connections with somebody who's been elected. And so it's good to work together like that. And from not the same or usual suspects, people who maybe you hadn't thought of working with before, but have a dog in this fight relative to housing, people who are homeless, education, health, all these folks are needed to address this problem. Certainly this year has shown us how we have to connect with other systems like healthcare. So most of the work happens locally on the regional committee level that you all will be in charge of. The steering committee sets policies, but the rubber really hits the road on the regional committee level. And that's where everything actually happens to serve people experiencing homelessness. There are steering committee subcommittees and work groups plan, and they oversee specific topics. And you see them broken out by definition, from the long-term or standing committees to work groups that usually are more short-term and focused. And I've already made my pitch for you joining one of these. And here are the standing subcommittees. And again, you might want to study this slide and see where you think you would fit in or where your interest lies. The funding and performance, if you're one who likes to move towards excellence, this might be the one for you. Trying to improve our system performance measures, progress towards our goal of putting ourselves out of work, right? coordinated entry, working harder to streamline the system on the ground for those who are already traumatized, to not traumatize them a second time by making them jump through unnecessary hoops, and so on. We just had fun recently with the nominating subcommittee, and that's how some of you got on this. The at-large members got here today. And I already mentioned the racial equity subcommittee. The funding application subcommittees, as I mentioned, are quite serious because they have to do with the federal funding that comes into the state and to your local communities and agencies. And the scorecard is what we use to be fair and clear about what the expectations are and how folks measure up to those. It's quite detailed. So a representative from each regional committee and at-large members equal to or less than the number of regional representatives are expected to serve and help with the determination of that criteria and scoring guidelines. And then, as we mentioned, there's the whole project review. And again, we would expect representatives from each regional committee and some at-large members equal to or less than the number of regional representatives. And here are the work groups. Well, I already kind of mentioned these. There are work groups. The steering committee forms short-term outcome-focused working groups on an as-needed basis. So we've gotten through the balance of state, but what is the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness role? As I mentioned, we serve as the collaborative applicant and the HMIS lead, and not just for our counties, but it goes into sharing agreements with a couple of other counties as well. So we staff the COC. Everything you all need is what we're charged with to do and support. We facilitate this, facilitates the COC and ESG competitions each year, and those are the two primary sources of federal funding for everyone. Ensuring that the COC meets HUD requirements, provides training and technical assistance for best practices, and HMIS to get you familiar with that process. And we serve as the grantee for those federal funds for HMIS and the Coordinated Entry Project. We have this year taken on a new, well, it's not a new role, it just got awfully busy because of COVID, and that is our executive director is a co-lead with the Interagency Council, on the Interagency Council for coordinating homelessness programs, ICCHP. Many states have this platform, and it's designed to help plan for and deploy this year federal COVID relief funds. It was a mechanism that was there, and so that's what the state largely relied on. And some of you may receive or know folks who are deploying the back at home funds that the state of North Carolina has underwritten with those CARES, the relief, the congressional relief money for COVID. I will tell you that we host a statewide COVID local leadership response call on alternating Wednesdays. The next one will be in January, the first Wednesday of January. This occurs at 1 o'clock for an hour. And we work hard to make sure that you do more of the talking than we do, if at all possible, unless we have specific information to share. State agency representatives participate routinely on these, so it's a great place to get your questions answered if you're having some challenges or if you have an excellent model that you want to share. And this is, if you go to our website, there's a lot, and what you need should be there. And if it's not, we'd want to hear about it. But you'll see going forward, if you ever feel like you're kind of awash with too much information, you can always go on your own pace at your own time and take a look at all this information that's there that we're talking about today. And here again are some resources, and I went ahead and grabbed those links for you, so you'll have them here on this slide relative to some of what we've talked about, but also resources that are coming up to get better versed on. And then there's a calendar toward the end there, and the governance charter, of which you are now a part, that you might want to take a peek at. Let's, any questions? If there's nobody hitting the chat, then I'll just invite you at this point. Any questions? We're going to go into the two major pieces of federal funding. Before we get there, anyone have anything to say? How am I doing, Bonnie? No one wants to talk to me but you.
You're doing great.
Thank you. All right. We're going to move into the detail of this. These are the two sources of federal funding. I mean, it's never enough to really address the problem, as we learned this year, but it is a sizable amount of money that has to be monitored and used well in order for it to keep flowing. And basically, you see them here. The two HUD programs are the main federal response programs to homelessness. And I did go to find out, because we haven't had this one this year drop, you know, the what's called the NOFA notice to let us know it's time to apply. I did get the 2019 grant for the COC. The state of North Carolina receives $27.7 million for the fiscal year for the first program. I did not get the ESG money for you because there has been such a lot of new funding coming as a result of COVID. It seemed like too big a job at the moment. So, but just to know, to give you a sense of scale, of those 12 COCs, 12, right? Not 13, I've forgotten already. The North Carolina Balanced Estate receives 1/3 of that total, so we get about 8.9 million that we distribute across the regions. And you can see there for yourself what the activities are under each, and we're going to go through those in a little more detail. So here's the process. For the COC funding, which we're waiting to hear, what you see here is local management entities. That's what the LME stands for, or managed care organizations, which manage the care of beneficiaries who receive services for mental health, developmental disabilities, or substance use disorders. These are the folks who apply. What you see there is the application process goes to the COC or through the COC, but the contracts themselves come back directly to the local agencies. So those local agencies are contracting directly with the federal government once we follow the process here through the COC, because we have so many regions, so many counties. So new applicants, they submit an intent to apply. And once it gets released, right, which could be next year, new and renewal applicants submit applications to the coalition, and we as staff complete the COC-wide application. That makes us the collaborative applicant. Our staff and the review committee review, score, and rank all the projects. And then the steering committee is the one, that's you all, who approves the ranked list of projects. And we submit that as one application to HUD. Then there's the EFT funding process. And that changed this year, and we're hoping it might stay this way based on the 2020 steering committee's desire. They liked the way we did it this year. And it took a little more work off of them, made it a little more streamlined, I hope. That's what we hear. And so just to explain this, it looks a little more complex, but what it does, well, let me move to the, well, I guess I can tell you. So in this situation, the new and renewed ESG applicants, they submit their applications to NCCEH for review, right, and selection. And then the COC staff review all renewal and new applications, and they flag any renewals that need extra review by the project review committee, which some of you may serve on. That committee, those members review new and flagged renewal applications, and they make a recommendation slate for approval by the steering committee. So they do the heavy lifting, they pass it on to us as the steering committee, to you, and you approve the final slate. And then our staff complete and submit the regional application, which goes to the Department of Health and Human Services. And the money is funneled through that state agency directly to each applicant. I thought this was pretty good. I did this slide and I feel like it says it all, I hope so. Any questions about those two funding sources or anything at all? I guess you just unmute yourself if you want to talk now, or you can also, for the shy among you, you can still use the chat. Okay, we're going to move forward and we're going to talk about system components. So as you have noticed, or you soon will realize, our projects, they operate within a system, a very definite system whose components are these. And this is the myriad ways that services are provided in our communities across the state to people who are literally homeless. So not on the verge or not about to be evicted, but are definitely already living in places not meant for permanent human habitation. So you can see prevention, diversion, street outreach, emergency shelter. A well-functioning, right-sized crisis response system has all of these components with the right amount of availability. So the shelter part is funded by ESG. Transitional housing folks are familiar with, are funded by both, no new projects there. Rapid rehousing is a newer approach for literally homeless. How it has housing plus case management and connection to other services. The goal is still getting folks housed as soon as possible by advocating with landlords, helping with housing search, providing financial assistance for deposits, utility payments. Average of 3 to 6 months of assistance to stabilize is successful because it focuses on the outcomes we want, right? Permanent housing. Mostly, historically, response to homelessness has been shelter, as we discussed, but folks need stability of housing, not temporary shelter. So we're trying to change the intervention solution to get people into permanent housing. And as I mentioned, it's less expensive on the long haul, gets better outcomes. So going through each of them one by one, prevention and diversion programs. And you know, it's interesting because I see Isaac's on this call today, this legal aid of North Carolina, and he's been doing a lot of this as a result of COVID, and also working, I believe, with the DHHS. Well, actually, I guess DHHS back at home. There's another program, the HOPE program with NCORE, but it's consists of financial assistance. I think I already mentioned this, providing resources to household to keep them where they are, because everyone knows it's a whole lot more expensive to start again than to try and stay put. And the idea is to prevent another episode of housing, so prevention.
I'll just add.
Yes, thank you.
This is Isaac. Just wanted to jump in. You know, the prevention piece is really important, I think, more than ever right now. And you know, one of the statistics we're looking at that I think was cited in Governor Cooper's one of his last executive orders is that there could be something like the 300,000 families in the state that are at risk of eviction at this point. The CDC Moratorium is a tool that we've been using to prevent evictions a lot of places across the state, but that moratorium is about to expire at the end of the year. And so we're currently worried about like a gigantic tsunami of evictions going into January. So we're all kind of, holding our breath right now, trying to see what's going to happen. We're hopeful that Congress will, extend some protections, or that the state will intervene. But as it stands right now, that's the fear, is that we could have, tens of thousands of cases being filed in January.
Thank you for that. And Isaac and I, and we haven't been on a call with Kelly, but certainly North Carolina Realtors have participated in conversations we've had with congressional members, and there is some hope about this weekend. There finally being, I think, the roadblock on the Senate side with the leader McConnell may be about to break here. And if in our call the other day, Isaac was part of that, Congressman Price's office felt that the $25 billion or something small like that may remain as rental assistance in that bill. That was the hope. And that's what's incredible, right, Kelly, that we're working together, both landlords and tenants, and because we all have something going on in this area, that we can help each other and hopefully get to a place where people are not homeless. I think that's the goal. I don't know that Kelly, I'm not gonna put Kelly on the spot because she's too new, but certainly speak up if you feel inclined. So then there's street outreach, something that people are, people are kind of together with shelters, are a little more familiar maybe with this. Folks who just don't want to be in shelters for whatever reason, want to be out on their own. It's still important to connect them to critical services, permanent housing. Emergency shelter, I meant to say, is what we're most familiar with. I think the general population thinks of homeless shelters. That really got turned on its head this year in terms of prioritizing need, because it was no longer a good idea to have people close together in shelters, right, where they could catch the virus. And so there's been a sea change in that, at least temporarily, and maybe we hope in a more permanent way. And then there's an example where the hotel motel industry, at least for a period, stepped in and allowed their rooms to be used to space folks apart more effectively in some communities. And that's where our local folks really did an incredible job with their county health offices, because it became a health issue, and they worked very hard to get those rooms, and we really appreciate that. We're also mindful of how much, as we move through, and we'll talk about this, I guess, to the last slide, there's also a lot of mom and pop landlords, and they have been without rental funds too. So there's so many different sides to this problem. Emergency shelters face unique unique challenges. We want to make, before it was like everybody go to the shelter, but now we're trying to make sure that the shelter is in fact the last resort, not the first. So we've closed the front door, so to speak, and opened the back door, which has to do with making sure that people can be connected to resources and programs to exit the shelter system into permanent housing as soon as possible. I mean, that is the goal. So one of the things that has come into this is prioritization of beds, utilizing diversion, like we talked about, so that people without other safe places to go have a safe place to stay temporarily. And then program rules, and this is about encouraging lower barriers to program entry with only rules that relate to safety. Back in those other decades, there had been a lot of barriers, as we mentioned, for folks needing housing or homeless or shelter to come in if they had to meet certain criteria that didn't really have much to do with anything outside of the safety of the folks who stayed there at night. And then there's rapid rehousing. And these are programs that quickly place families in permanent housing, short, medium-term financial assistance and housing stabilization. You might think in terms of domestic violence shelters. But these are stabilization services for people experiencing literal homelessness. It connects people quickly to housing and focuses services on income, procurement, and connection to other services that they may need so they can stabilize. Generally, it's used for a less vulnerable household that just needs a short influx of assistance to stabilize. And the program model takes a progressive approach to housing assistance. It assesses each household for its specific needs and provides only what it needs. And while assistance can be up to 24 months, most households need only about 3 to 6 months of assistance before they get out of the program. Developing relationships with landlords is pretty pivotal to this, so that we can allow programs to serve households with various barriers to getting and keeping housing. And I can tell you that one of the exciting projects that we have started and will interface too with in the new year is something we're doing with Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's called Housing Connections, and it does focus on more of a partnership with landlords and the service providers we ordinarily work with to address this piece that I just mentioned. Permanent supportive housing is the gold standard, of course, right? We would want to provide fast, permanent, and supportive services to people to get them in homes and keep them there. And HUD is encouraging permanent supportive housing to utilize a housing first approach that we've talked about. And so it decreases the eligibility requirements so that people can use it. Programs are looking at move-on models now to increase turnover in these PSH programs. For those who are willing and no longer need the long-term services, the idea is to help them move in and out of the program to self-sufficient permanent housing that they can manage. I'm going to go into coordinated entry, and then my colleague, Ashley Von Hatton's going to pick it up and get into some details, but just by way of introduction, we've hit on it a little bit, but coordinated entry basically shifts the response to homelessness from programs to systems, right? So again, taking a page from in my view, the for-profit world, trying to be efficient and effective as we can be. And so here, I definitely think my graphic was better than this one, but let's see if we can make some sense of it. So what you see here is people receiving services on a first come, first served basis was not based on their need, okay, before coordinated entry. You sure you don't want to take this, Ashley? Sounds
Yeah,
pretty cool.
I can take the next handful of slides.
Yeah, let's let you go. And so Ashley has come to us from the Kentucky. Is yours called the Coalition? It was called the Coalition for the Homeless as well?
We were Kentucky Housing Corporation.
Okay, and so she has hit the ground running because she definitely came into it already knowing a lot. I'm going to shut my mic down and let you take it from here, and then you might need to just let me know when you need a new slide.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, so I started with NCCEH in June and was hired mainly for balance of state coordinated entry. That has been shifted a little bit just because of COVID and the back at home program, but I'm definitely looking forward to the upcoming year and hopefully having the chance to really hit the ground running when it comes to balance of state coordinated entry. So before coordinated entry, it really was just a program level response to homelessness. People were kind of hitting in the system at different access points. They weren't really being assessed in the same way across the board, and they were getting kind of connected to housing in a more first come, first serve sort of basis instead of really an order of priority. You can go to the next slide. So like I said before, people were receiving services on a first come, first serve basis, not based on their need or their acuity. Accessing services was difficult and time consuming. Clients were definitely expected to navigate through the system on their own. And I think everybody on this call can appreciate how hard it is to navigate the system sometimes. So we really wanted to move away from that. And really using resources, they weren't being used in an effective way because low need people were receiving high cost resources and vice versa. So we were really trying to match the need of that person to the resource as well. And then communities did not know the real need for homeless services. Thank you. So coordinated entry tries to solve these problems. We have defined access points into the homeless system with clear referrals to emergency services. All clients are assessed in the exact same way for permanent housing. For North Carolina balance of state, that is currently the VI-SPDAT assessment. However, we are having conversations about changing that process in the future. Permanent housing programs take all referrals through coordinated entry. Like I said before, it was a first come, first serve, and now it's really shifted to order of priority. And because those permanent housing resources, those programs all have to take referrals through the CE system, that really allows us to understand that process better and assist people with the highest need first. And then it also allows us to really navigate the system for the clients instead of expecting them to figure out how to get access to housing when they're already experiencing a crisis. So the basic coordinated entry system has an access point, and from that access point, you can either be sent through kind of a diversion path where you are finding housing on your own, or you have other resources that you can use so you don't have to enter the emergency shelter system. If somebody is in the shelter system or living unsheltered, then they can get assessed and prioritized based on their need and connected to permanent housing through that process. So the way that North Carolina Balance of State does coordinated entry is you have the access point, which is where somebody presents, or those are also called front door. We have front door agencies. So they complete the prevention and diversion screening. They are either diverted away from the system through that process, or they could possibly enter emergency shelter or be accessed through street outreach. From there, there's two kind of different paths. They can self-resolve out of homelessness on their own, or after 14 days in shelter, or it's completed immediately when you have contact with somebody that's living unsheltered, you'll complete the VI-SPDAT, and that number will correlate with the prioritization along with some other factors to get that household on the community-wide list. Each community meets, they have regional meetings where everybody in that community that is a housing provider or emergency service provider meets, and they discuss the prioritization list. They do that through case conferencing, and then it is determined what the best resource is or is available for that client, and that's how they are moved through the system. So just as an extra piece, when it comes to coordinated entry access and back at home, Back at Home is really just another pot of funding that we have on the table right now because of COVID. So in order to access those resources for Back at Home, rapid rehousing, or homeless prevention, that can either be through 211, which they are taking referrals and completing assessments for those clients, or there is a coordinated entry referral representative, which right now that is really overlaying in each region with our coordinated entry leads as well. So either the 211 staff person or the CE referral representative will complete the Back at Home assessment with the client. And then if that client has initial eligibility, they will be referred to the Back at Home rehousing agency. But I just wanted to point out that this process does not replace coordinated entry. It kind of sits parallel to it right now, where coordinated entry is still the process to get linked to permanent housing, and Back at Home is really the process to get linked to those Back at Home resources. So it's only for those resources. So the structure for North Carolina Balance of State for coordinated entry, it really starts on the ground with the regional coordinated entry leads. They are identifying people that need to have access to the system. They are completing the VS Vidats. They are having the case conferencing meetings. All of the leads and other statewide representatives are also on the Coordinated Entry Council. And then in conjunction with that, there's also the Balance of State Steering Committee. So everybody's really working together to ensure that structure is working not just on a Balance of State level, but kind of for everybody else, and definitely the regional leads that are on the ground doing a lot of that heavy lifting. So I believe that's my last slide, but I am happy to pause and take any questions or if anybody has any feedback.
Okay, nothing in the chat?
Nope, I recognize a lot of names on the call. They are definitely, there's definitely some coordinated entry gurus on this call. So I think.
So we don't want to call one out, huh?
I think they hear from me enough, Deborah. I'll let them be.
Well, that was perfect timing, because just as you took over, one of the many trains that comes by here rolled by. So that was good timing.
Oh,
yeah.
Perfect.
So, thanks, Ashley. I appreciate it. And now I want to also introduce another staff person, Andrea Carey. She's going to take up the section relative, I'm sorry, there it is. Data and Homeless Management Information System. I'm going to let her take this last section.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. This is Andrea Carey from the data center side of the North Carolina Coalition to End Homelessness. And so what we want to do is give you just a brief foundation in the data we use and how it's critical to the COC's work. All right, so first off, we do want to recognize this component and its importance. What we do with the HMIS, or that Homeless Management Information System, is track a lot of data around services being provided to clients experiencing homelessness or perhaps imminently at risk of homelessness. Within that, we can also track demographics, different ages, different service patterns, and provide insight into who's using our services, for how long, and analyzing that based on different project types or different years. We want to see our progress overall towards that final outcome of ending homelessness, right? So HMIS also does help us track the program outcomes and performance. And what we mean by that is that we can track information, success, outcomes, that access to permanent housing by each agency or project, as well as by the entire COC, right? So we can use different slices of the data to see what's going on in general, and more specifically for for funding uses for those specific projects and their outcomes. With tracking the whole COC, we track the system performance in particular. So we'll go in a little bit detail in just a moment, but making sure that, as we are setting up these systems, the systems are actually fulfilling the goals that we have. These systems are our creation, and so it's up to us to monitor that and to make sure that they're working for everyone. The other thing we do is, with our system performance, is submit this data to HUD, and we can see how our COC performs in comparison to other COCs. So HUD publishes all of this data on system performance, and so we're able to compare a little bit between our, between balances of state, between folks within North Carolina, and have some insights there. Demographics over time are really important in HMIS as well, because we've been, looking at different kind of targeted efforts for folks. So, there's been really big pushes in reducing veterans homelessness, for example, and we see the results of that push and that resource allocation in the data over time. You can see that year to year. So having a consistent database with this data, for many years now, we've got a pretty complete set of data since 2015, but it does go all the way back to 2010 or so in its first iteration. That just helps us see our work over time and how it's changed. As Ashley and Deborah have also mentioned, we use HMIS to coordinate services as well. HMIS is helping us see who is seeking services at any given time in each region, and then also who's actually been connected. So, making sure that just after you make a referral, they actually do get to that permanent housing project, they're enrolled, and ultimately, we're hoping they find housing as well, have that positive outcome. So that's really helpful for coordinating services. And there is also a compliance part of this, right? So we are required to report on specific programs and then on COC-wide data to HUD. So we also use HMIS to fulfill that. There are just a couple limits to keep in mind when we're thinking through HMIS and particularly this data at the COC and governance level. HMIS can only show us what we put into it. So HMIS coverage right now in the balance of state is about 58% of our beds, which is pretty good. And we have a plan to increase that over the next year or so. But, that leaves a significant portion of providers and services in the community that aren't seen in HMIS. So it's just good to keep in mind that when we look at HMIS data, it only covers HMIS participating agencies. Also, data quality. Whenever we present data, we'll also keep in mind data quality, whether that's timeliness, completeness, accuracy. We have improved our data quality as a system dramatically over the last few years. It's been really exciting to kind of dig into the data with high quality. But we just always want to keep in mind that, data quality varies. Everyone is trying to give the best services they can to the client. And so sometimes that can impact the data that's entered in. And then, just keeping in mind that we can't pull any data that we don't enter. So we won't go through all the questions that we track in HMIS, but it's just a good thing to keep in mind that our database is limited to what we collect and what we are consistently entering into the system. And let's see, so looking at the data overall, there are some key COC performance reports that we want to highlight. These are the HUD reports that we're required to submit every year for the balance of state. The point in time count and housing inventory count happens in the last 10 days of January. And we use HMIS data as well as non-HMIS data to complete that. The longitudinal system analysis is a more robust annual data set than our point in time and housing inventory count reports. If you think about PIT and HIC as a snapshot, that picture you take on one night in January every year, the LSA is looking at 365 nights. It's looking at that whole year's worth of data from HMIS. So it is only an HMIS report, but it gives us a really robust data set. And this is the third year that we're calling it the longitudinal system analysis, which is just the HMIS side of the annual homelessness assessment report. So ultimately, Congress gets that annual homelessness assessment report, the AHAR, and it includes both HMIS data and other data sets as well. So we contribute to the LSA to send it to Congress ultimately. And then finally, there's also system performance measures, which are a series of different outcomes. Here we go. These 6 here that every COC in the country is tracking and submitting to HUD. And we'd like to highlight a couple in particular. There's 3 of these outcomes and performance measures that are, what HUD wants us to focus on, but really are just critical in telling us what the system is doing for clients. Are we really, reducing homelessness, making homelessness brief, rare, and non-recurrent? So if we go into the next slide, let's go here. Yes, so the first one is length of time homeless. This is just a really big one. We want to make sure that folks are not experiencing homelessness for a long time, right? We know that there's trauma and instability with that experience that we want to reduce and get folks, back in housing as soon as possible. So measuring the length of time homeless is a really critical part to our success, making sure that we are, having housing focused conversations in emergency shelter and transitional housing projects. Overall, our goal for this measure is to reduce the length of time of folks experiencing homelessness. No worries. Let's go on to the second one. Okay, so returns to homelessness. This is another key metric for our performance as a COC. So if we look at the entire COC, we're looking at street outreach, emergency shelter, transitional housing, and our permanent housing projects. We're looking at all of those projects for a permanent housing exit destination. So if folks have found housing and they've moved in, then we mark that as a permanent housing destination. And only from that group do we look to see who's returned. So if folks are marked as not finding permanent housing, they're not included as a return to homelessness. This is really looking at the stability of the permanent housing that we've connected folks with. And so our goal here is to reduce the percentage of persons who return to homelessness. And so it's within the COC, we can look at all these different projects and see, no matter where someone exited, if they return to any other project in the COC, we can identify them and note that that they're seeking services again. And then the last kind of major performance measure that we want to highlight is this measure 7, permanent housing placement and retention. I think it's okay to have favorites of the system performance measures. This is my favorite. It's always exciting when we're housing folks, right? So this is really that measure of the exits to permanent housing from our emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing projects. And then for permanent supportive housing, that particular type of project is is meant as a long-term support. So it's actually a success for folks to stay in permanent supportive housing, as well as maybe exiting if they no longer need those wraparound services. So that's why this measure is both placement and retention. Overall, with this one, we are trying to increase the percentage of people who exit to or retain permanent housing. All right, so those are the three main ways that we want to measure performance in the COC. Yeah, Deborah.
That's your last slide there, Andrea. Thank you so much.
All right, and I'll drop my email in the chat as well, just in case other folks have questions.
All right. Thank you. So we're nearing the end here. So you really have made it through your first hurdle. It's a long, detailed webinar, but honestly, it is a nice resource to have going forward for you. Basically, I just wanted to share with you the 2021 steering committee meetings, and then already a couple others relative to the emergency solutions grants have occurred on the January calendar. So I'll tell you about those. These are the dates. It's always the first Tuesday morning of every month. And we start at 10:30. So it's 10:30 to noon. I think I sent these actually to you all in the email as well. And then there will be, so that you are aware, there's also a couple of meetings. Let's see if I have them here. Well, I believe those dates are January 15th and January 20th. That was in the email as well. And what those dates are, there's a definite meeting on the first one because we need to approve those that collection of grant applications for the ESG funding for next year. And then the second date, each of them start at noon. I think the second one is on the 20th. We're thinking that may be canceled if nobody appeals the decisions that you make in the first meeting. So take a look at that email I sent you, and you'll see those to put those on your calendar as well as the ones that are each month, and just put that on it as a recurring calendar on your dance card. Now you've got something to do the first Tuesday of every month. I wanted to point out that we will be meeting for the first time in what hopefully will be a better year on January 5th at 10:30. Here is our information should you need to get in touch with anybody beforehand. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope this was useful to you, and certainly let us know if we can do anything for you between now and when we start together in the steering committee of 2021. Thank you, everyone. We'll get you out a few minutes early anyway. We appreciate it.